Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. If you would like to jump right to a specific point in the video, you will find the chapter titles and links to those chapters in the video timeline, or you can go to the video description and find the links to those sections of the video as well. So today I have one tidbit. I have two questions I'm going to answer. I have a brief update to my 1890s sweater in progress, and then I want to show you how I reorganized the yarn in my office, and then the revelation I had about a future sweater that came from that reorganization. So let's get started. So I have one tidbit today, and that is an episode of a podcast called Dressed: The History of Fashion. And this episode is on the history of paper patterns, and what that is sewing patterns. But it was a fascinating episode. They do podcasts twice a week, Tuesday and Thursday. So I'll link to their podcast down below, specifically this particular episode, which I just found so interesting. What's fascinating is that there were no books published on dressmaking or tailoring until the 19th century, the early 19th century, so the early 1800s, which is interesting because people have been clothed for a lot longer than that. But the secret, like tailors and dressmakers kept their methods secret, and they taught them to their apprentices, but they didn't publish them anywhere. So different people had different systems for how to figure out how to scale up a pattern or scale it down. The thing that I think I was most surprised by was to discover that among all these people who were starting to publish their systems of tailoring, this one guy he invented the tape measure. I'm like, I couldn't believe that the tape measure hadn't already been invented. I just never considered that. But apparently what they used to do was take a strip of fabric for a particular client, and they would use that fabric to measure different parts, and they would mark on that piece of fabric. They probably had a symbol or something for different measurement points. And they just had that strip of fabric, and that was associated with that client. I've talked before about Butterick, and specifically the women's magazine called The Delineator, which they published, and how it was sort of a marketing tool for selling their sewing patterns. This apparently was true for all of the different companies that were selling sewing patterns. And so it's just fascinating to hear about the different approaches that they had, and how at first they just had little schematics for these patterns, and they didn't really have any written instructions, because girls would have been, as part of their education, taught sewing techniques and would have been familiar with garment construction and somehow would have needed to know that. But over time, they did start including actual written instructions with the patterns. But it is just a really fascinating podcast. And part of what I find so interesting is that they were developing this system of paper sewing patterns in the 19th century when the Industrial Revolution was in full swing and was being kind of driven by advances in textile manufacturing, and that at the same time, written knitting patterns are being developed. And I am wondering if, I know that written knitting patterns came about in part because it was middle-class women who were learning to knit, who weren't raised with that, and they were using it as a way of showing their productivity, and they were doing fancy and practical things for their family, rather than what servants maybe were doing, which is knitting the really utilitarian things, which would have been done in the past. So there's this shift in who is making clothing and what kind of clothing they're making, and knitting becomes a lot more popular in the 19th century because people have more time to knit, because the textile manufacturing is offloading a lot of the work of garment construction. So this is just fascinating to me that these things were all happening kind of at the same time. So again, I'll link down to in the video description to that particular episode. I've listened to a few other episodes on their podcast. A lot of them are, 20 minutes long because they do them twice a week and they focus on a particular topic. So I'm finding it really interesting and I thought I would share that with you. I have two questions that I want to answer today. One of them came from a comment that was on a video I have on mirrored decreases. So if you are needing to do decreases at each end of a row, how do you do them so that they're mirrored? That means that they're either both leaning toward the center or both leaning away. How do you do that? How do you know which type to do at which end? And I'll link to that video up here. So the question in the comments was, what is every alternate row? Every knit row? Would every row mean purl and knit? And so what they're referring to is that instructions for decreasing often will tell you to decrease on the next row and then every alternate row this many times. And so this person is asking, what does that mean? What does every alternate row mean? Well, it means every other row. So when you work a row of knitting, you're working across all of the stitches. That's a row. So whether it's a knit row, a purl row, or some other kind of row that's a mixture of knits and purls, that's one row. So every alternate row would be every other row. So if you have established your decreases on a right side row, and then you're told to do it on every alternate row, that means every right side row is when you would be doing those decreases. Now, there is another instruction that isn't as common, but it's one that does throw people, and that is every alternate right side row. What that means is you're working every other right side row. In other words, you work your decreases on a right side row, then you work a wrong side row, then you work another right side row, and then another wrong side row, and then you work on a right side row, you're working the decreases. So every other right side row is like every fourth row. Every row means whether it's a right side of the work or the wrong side of the work, you're going to be doing whatever it is they're telling you. Every alternate row is the same as every other row. So if you're doing something the first time on a right side row, you'll continue to do that always on the right side row. Every alternate right side row means every fourth row. You're not doing it every right side row, you're doing it every other right side row. So I had a question that came up in my Ravelry group a couple of weeks ago, and the question is, you can steek a pullover pattern to make a cardigan. So in other words, you can take a pattern that was meant to be worked in the round, and you can steek it, which is cutting the knitting. You can cut it up the front, and then pick up button bands and turn it into a cardigan. So you can do that. The question is, can you take a cardigan pattern and do the opposite and just knit it in the round in order to make it a pullover pattern? And the answer is you can, but there are some things to think about. Number one is that, well, first of all, a cardigan pattern is designed the same way as a pullover. It's like you would, the front and the two fronts combined are going to be the same stitch count, the same size as the back. But there might be some modifications done in order to create symmetry in a stitch pattern. The second thing to keep in mind is that stitch pattern is going to be worked differently when you are knitting in the round than it's worked when you're knitting flat. If you're working from charts, you can use the same chart and knit in the round that you would use if you were knitting flat. So that's just the kind of thing that you need to keep track of. The size of the pattern of the pieces are the same, but you do have to think about the symmetry of the stitch patterns. You also have to think about the fact that you're not going to be knitting a right side row and then a wrong side row. You're only going to be knitting right side rows. So the direction that you're knitting, and if you're knitting a knit purl pattern, you're going to have to translate that stitch pattern into one that can be worked on the right side row every time. So there are some things to think about, but it could be done, particularly if the stitch pattern has been charted. That will make things much, much easier. So I have a brief update to my 1890s sweater. I did my third iteration of this portion of the sweater from the shoulders to the base of the neck. When I first read this pattern, I was pretty sure that the instructions as written were not going to work, that it was far too many rows to be working for this upper yoke part in addition to the neck that had to be worked. I just couldn't see how it was going to work out. I wanted to try the instructions as written, and then when I confirmed that they were not going to work, to rip that out and then do an alternative to that could potentially work. So on the second try, I thought maybe it had worked, and I continued on and knit the entire turtleneck, and it ended up not fitting at all. So I needed to cut the neck off. So I cut the neck off and kept that separate. And then I re-knit the shoulder shaping at the top right here. And so what I ended up doing was basically decreasing every row. This calls for 4 decreases in any given decrease round. And so I just did them every single round, and I got an appropriate slope line that actually worked. So then the next step was grafting the neck back on. Now, I totally understand how grafting works. I don't have any problem grafting stockinette or garter stitch right off the needles. I have absolute muscle memory for how that works, and I understand conceptually what to do. The problem is I am not working in stockinette, I'm working in ribbing. Typically, if I were going to be grafting something like this in ribbing, I would know this ahead of time, and I would prepare for it and would do it, prepare in a way that would work for me and the way my brain works for understanding how grafting functions. But I couldn't plan for that ahead of time because I was cutting the neck off. So I have to graft with live stitches on the needles. I have a problem, like spatially doing the mental gymnastics for that. But my technical editor at Interweave has written a series of articles on grafting that I often link to whenever I'm answering questions in the technique forums on Ravelry. And she specifically talks about grafting a ribbing pattern like this. And she has the instruction, she explains it conceptually, and then she's got this instruction on what sort of the pattern is that you are doing when you're grafting off the needles. And so I read through that, and I trusted her, and I was reading the instructions, and I was doing the grafting, and I thought, well, I'd done a few of them. I'm just going to check to make sure that it was correct, because if you've ever done grafting live off the needles, you'll know that, especially in stockinette, you have this little mantra in your head: knit off, purl on. And then on the back needle, purl off, knit on. And what that means is that you are entering that first stitch as if to knit, but you're taking it off the needle. So you're entering as if to knit and taking it off the needle. And then the next stitch that's on that same needle, you're entering as if to purl, but you're letting it stay on. So we say knit off, purl on, and then on the other needle, you purl off and knit on. So you're always entering those 2 stitches in the opposite way. When you're grafting ribbing in pattern off of live stitches on the needle, the sequence is different. That when you're entering these pairs of stitches, you always enter them the same way. So if you do a knit off, then you're doing a knit on. If you're doing a purl off, then you're doing a purl on. And I have this embedded muscle memory for inserting one way and coming out the other way, or coming in this way and going that way. So I'm having to overcome my muscle memory for that. And then in addition, you don't just alternate what you do in the front needle with what you do in the back needle. You might be doing knit off, knit on the back, and then when you get to the front, you do knit off, knit on as well. And then you switch to purl off, purl on, purl off, purl on. So I had this muscle memory I had to overcome. But I was trusting her directions and I was following them, but I wanted to check because I wasn't convinced that I was doing it correctly. And I looked at it and I was off. And I didn't have that half stitch offset that you get sometimes when you are knitting two pieces of fabric that were both knit in the same direction like this, and then you're trying to graft them together like that. If you're doing ribbing in that way and grafting it, you'll be a half stitch off no matter what you do. But in my case, I was grafting ribbing that was knit this way. It was the same piece of fabric that had all been knit in the same direction. It just had been cut and needed to be put back together again. I was a full stitch off. I had a knit column coming up to a purl column, and the purl column joined with the knit column. So I was off. And I thought, oh, I had just screwed up something. So I took everything out, and I waited a day because I was mad. And then I did it again, made sure that I was, doing everything exactly the way I was supposed to. And I looked at it and off again. And so that was yesterday. So tonight I'll do it a third time. I finally realized what the problem was. The problem is not Joni's instructions. The problem was that Joni's instructions, I think, are written for flat knitting, so with selvages. And I have something that was knit in the round. And so I'm going to have to look and see what she has said about that. But otherwise, I think I know what I need to do that's different than what I was doing. It's one of those things where I know that once I get it going, I'll be able to understand it better. And then I can show you guys on video how it works. And I will also link to her. I'll link to it right now. I'll link to Joni's article. She's got this. The series on grafting is really amazing. That's where I am on this, is that I need to restart the grafting one more time. So last week I gave you a kind of a tour of my library and how I have that organized. And the next thing that I needed to address in my office here was my yarn, because it was starting to get out of control again. And a lot of these bins were getting full and I didn't really know what was in them. And I was feeling like my yarn stash, which is stash wall, which is on this side of my office, I was feeling like it was looking both barren and weird, and I needed to address everything. What's funny to me is anytime I tweak my office, it happens every couple of years, my needs change, and I just, like, most things are working, but maybe the clutter level is getting too high for me. And one of the reasons it's getting too high is because I've run out of places to put things. And so I kind of need to address things. I might need to cull stash, or I might need to get rid of things that I'm storing in this office that don't need to be here. I usually identify a problem, and I've been thinking about how to address that. And I did that with my books and then my vintage booklets, where I had those in stacks and they were taking up room on the floor. And I thought, how can I get this off the floor? And how can I organize it in a way that's useful? And I figured out, hanging files by decade for the vintage stuff makes a lot of sense. So I solved that problem, rearranged my books, made room for things that were getting crowded. And then I thought, okay, now I just need to go through my yarn again, because I had this well-established setup for my yarn that I thought, worked, pretty well for me. And I just wasn't thinking about actually reorganizing it. I was just thinking about going through it. And so I did that Marie Kondo thing where you take everything of a particular category and you put it all on the floor. Then I felt very overwhelmed by what I saw on the floor, because there was so much more yarn on the floor than I thought I had. And it came from these bins. I just didn't expect that. And I wasn't prepared to think about it. This happened a few years ago when I'm like, I need to get rid of half of my yarn because I don't have room to put anything away. And I got rid of half of it, and I got rid of my genealogy stuff and cleared the floor off. And so I was reorganizing everything, and I thought, okay, the last thing I need to do is just find all of my UFOs. And I'll just go through the Marie Kondo thing, put them all on the floor, and I found every UFO, and I was overwhelmed by the quantity of it, which is, I think, kind of the point of this Marie Kondo system, is to really address how much stuff you have. But the problem was with the UFOs, it was like, oh my God, how am I going to handle this? And then once I realized, well, it's a manageable amount of stuff to get through in a year, and if I just work on this for a year, how do I organize it? How do I deal with it in a way that I can get through those and know where things are? So that took me, a few days, maybe a week, to kind of just get my head wrapped around these UFOs. So I think it was like Sunday maybe, when I pulled all the yarn out of all of my bins, because I knew I had been stuffing yarn in there that really didn't go in there. So I put it all on the floor, and I had that same feeling of being overwhelmed, like, I don't know what to do with this. So I had yarn on my floor most of this week, and I was watching episodes on Netflix. There's this show called The Home Edit, and I watched the first 10 minutes of it, and I thought, oh, I can't stand this. It's a little bit too much. Everybody's so excited and they're so enthusiastic, and I just couldn't stand it. But then my sister-in-law said she'd been watching it, and she kind of explained how the episodes are arranged, and so I went back and I watched it. So what was interesting to me was to see how they think through categories. And because, like, if you have a set of games or something for kids, like, one way to categorize them would be, like brain games, or this kind of game or that kind of game. But when it's for kids, they tend to do things by rainbow category, like all of the red games, all of the blue games, all of the green games, that kind of thing. And they do that with kids' books too, because that way the kid has a red book and they know how to put the red book away. Well, that's not going to work for my knitting library, but I do have ways of categorizing things that make sense to me. They might not make sense to somebody else, but they make sense to me. And so it helps me to know where to put it away or where to look for it. And so that was the struggle I was having with this yarn, was like, how do I categorize the yarn that I have, and how do I decide what goes on the stash wall versus what goes in bins on the wall? And so I have a few other things that I still need to categorize that do belong in bins. Like, I have things like swatches and samples and project experiments that I kind of haven't addressed yet, but it's this thinking about how to categorize something for the organization, because sometimes that's what has to shift when I'm reorganizing my office, is how I categorize something, because the needs of what I need from my office changes over time, because how I knit changes. So the last time I really reorganized was in 2016. And then at the end of 2016, the yarn shop where I taught closed, and I started teaching on YouTube in 2017. And then in 2018, I started doing these Casual Friday episodes. And that has changed. I also started, the same year I started doing technique videos, I started writing for Interweave Press for their various knitting magazines. So I was producing swatches like I hadn't before. In some cases, they're really big and they're useful, and I need to store them. They aren't things I'm knitting that are now leaving. It's not like when I was finishing my UFOs, they left my office and made more room. Instead, I am making a swatch and it's staying in here, or I'm knitting a hat project or a mitten project or something like that that's staying here, and that's filling up these bins. And so I have to think about how to categorize these things, and so that I can find them and I know, like, where to put them away. So this is just, how it's taking me a few weeks. It's not just I'm cleaning up my office and putting everything away. It's like I have to figure out how to categorize things. So I'm going to take you on a tour of my office before, when the floor is completely empty. This table I'm sitting in front of wasn't here. The tripod the camera's on wasn't here. The lights that I have on either side of me weren't here. Everything was out of the room. So I'm going to take you through a little tour now. This rug is 5 feet by 8 feet, so that's really the floor space that I have in my office. And then on each of the walls I have storage. You're going to see my tripod here because I'm going to set that up. And then I have my main new yarn storage is right here, and underneath is where I put all of those vintage magazines and booklets that I have. Those are stored under there. And then on this wall, which is something you see when I'm recording Casual Fridays and my technique videos. This is a wall here. I do have a few things on the floor right now. One is this pink bag is full of yarn that I'm donating to Minnesota Knitters Guild. It's all full skeins, that's what they want. And then this bin is stuff that it's yarn that I haven't quite figured out what to do with. And then there's a sweater on top that my mother-in-law gave to me years ago. I loved it. It's this long cardigan with pockets in it, made from cashmere, and I wore through the left elbow, and I have no interest in repairing it, but I do have an interest in recreating it. So I have a plan for that. And this is just for my audio. When I'm recording, the camera records it, but I record through my mic separately as well. That had to be plugged in. I have this plug bar here. So this section right here, I showed you guys last week, this stuff is all going to go. The unit's going to stay there. The stuff on those shelves doesn't really belong in the office. It's my genealogy stuff, and I want my genealogy stuff all to be in one place. But when I get rid of the stuff from there, then I'll have room for this red bin down here, which came out of this wall because I had to remove the bin in order to make room for some of the new books, and also have room for things on this shelf right here, my T-pins and things like that for blocking. Behind my door, I have my blocking pads are hanging from a wall. Up here is just basically this stuff is all decoration. It's yarn in rainbow colors that I don't really use, but I like the way it looks. Now my desk, it's messy, but honestly, it's about as clean as it ever gets. So if that is upsetting to you, sorry. This is a needle holder that I made a few years ago, and it has a slot for each size from 00, which is, I think it's a 1.75 millimeter, and then I go all the way up to US 17, which is a 12 millimeter. So this yarn that's hanging from the wall here, and then there's this wire across here, that's all one curtain wire, goes around the corner I got from IKEA years ago, and it just hangs the decorative items. So what I have here, these are all things I use for either taking photos of things or trying things on. Well, this is an adult man size foot, and I do use this sometimes for demonstration purposes in my videos. I would really like to get another one just like it that is smaller, that would be able to fit socks for me. And then over here I have like my ball winder and my Swift and my Nostapinna that my brother made me. So I have all my ball winding things over here. This is worsted weight yarn that I use for my technique videos. The bottom two bins, this is something that's new. It's new-ish. I used to have this bin up here, and it's sort of worsted weight leftovers. So what I have in this one, so these are all the colored yarns, and then down here I have the neutrals. So I have a lot of different grays, and I have black and natural down there in leftover format. My leftover sock yarn. So when I finish a pair of socks, if I need to rewind the leftovers, I will, and I'll just put it in here. I don't do those modular knit projects, but I know people who do. And so every year or two, I have somebody in a knitting group or somebody somewhere will say, does anybody have leftover sock yarn? I'm doing this modular knit and I'm out of sock yarn. So I'll just bring them the bin and they pick through what they want. So it gets used over time eventually. This is a lot of baby yarn. Again, these small skeins that don't work well in my wall stash system. A lot of leftovers. The bottom here is solid color sock yarn. So it's wool and nylon blends. I use this sometimes if I'm doing a sock toe or sock heel tutorial. I might use one of these solid color yarns, but I also like to do contrast heels, and so I use it for that. These three that have the blue post-its on it, it all says needs sorting. Let me look in here. So like this is a swatch I did for an interweave article on stranded color work when you're also switching between just a solid color and stranded. And so this was something that was big and was really good as a teaching tool, and so I asked to have it sent back to me. What I have over here is, this is a lot of samples in here, so I have another one full of samples. it's like a specific category of samples that I have in here. This one, I put on here vintage yarn because I have bought some vintage yarn, not to use for a project, but because I wanted to understand that yarns. Because I'm not going to use them, it makes sense to store them, but I need to keep a label in there just to remind me that that's what's in there. And down here I have a lot of super bulky. Most of it is acrylic, and so it's stuff that I use occasionally, but not very often. It doesn't need to be near me, and so I just have it in here. And then this is the laptop graveyard. It's my old Dell laptop. It needs to be relocated, and then I'll get this bin back. So I'm going to try not to be headless this time, but the problem with not being headless is that you can't see what I have. The main way that this is organized, this is my wall of new yarn that this is what I actually consider to be my stash. All of that stuff in bins, I don't really consider that to be stash. I consider that to be leftovers or available for swatching, things like that. This is actually what I consider to be my stash. So this half, this is 2 bins wide by 4 bins deep. This is all worsted weight wool. And I think I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sweaters worth of yarn for sweaters that have not been started yet. This one was knit and it's not going to be used, so that's been returned to stash. This bin right here has got red yarn that is my 1890s sweater that's in progress, and there's a natural black wool in there that I'm using for an Aran sweater that's in progress. So these are 2 sweaters that are in progress and those are not. And then I just have some stash yarn in some quantities, but not sweater quantities right here. On this side, this is sock yarn all up at the top. This is like hand painted type yarns here. I don't use very much. That's the reason I have so many of them hanging from that curtain wire, but I want to keep them visible to remind me. And then I have my self-striping yarn. So these are like the closest within reach to my desk because if I'm going to knit a pair of socks, I need 1 ball of it and I can just reach over and look at it. So everything from here down is stuff that I don't use very much. It's yarn weights I don't have a lot of, and I want to encourage myself to remember that I have it. So if I put this stuff in bins, I would completely forget about it. I can put worsted weight, half balls of yarn in a bin and be aware that it's there because I'm in that drawer all the time. It's like going into my silverware drawer. I know what's in my silverware drawer because I'm in there all the time. But some other drawer somewhere else in the house that I don't go into very often, if I put something that I don't use very often in a drawer I don't go into very often, it doesn't exist in my head. This year is my first year working with Shetland wool, and so I have a couple of hats worth of yarn over here that I want to get into this winter. I have yarn I got from a friend at the dog park. It's a really rustic wool from some kind of sheep farm on the West Coast or East Coast. Somebody gave it to my friend's wife. She's a knitter. She didn't like how rough it was. So it's very rustic. So there's like a pound of it, almost 500 grams of this yarn. And I just want it in my eyesight. It's been inside a bag in a bin for a couple of years. And I always forget it. Every time I open that bin, I'm like, oh yeah, I forgot about this. So I thought I'm going to put it up here. And then I have things organized by weight. I have Sport, DK, Aran, and Bulky at the bottom. So again, I don't use those a lot. And it's the kind of thing where once in a while I want something in bulky weight and I need to have yarn available to swatch with. And that's in many cases what this yarn is essentially for, is swatching in those yarn weights. This is what I consider my actual stash. So one of the things that I showed you that was in this bin that was sitting on the floor was this cashmere sweater that I have had for years and has been in a bin. It was like in a bin, the bin that used to be right here. It was sitting in here for years and I never went in that bin, so I didn't think about it. It's a fairly simple cable pattern, but it's an interesting cable because of how wide it is, but how flat it is, because the crossing part of it actually is done with a decreasing sequence, so that, or multiple crossings every couple of stitches at a time. I really like this a lot, and I've been wanting to recreate it for a number of years. So about a year ago, I was at our guild's knitting retreat, and we always have a dyeing class that you can take, you can sign up for if you want. And I dyed this skein of red yarn. So it's kind of tonal. There are light portions to darker portions. And I didn't want to just make a hat or something out of it. I wanted to include it in a sweater of some kind. So about a month after I'd made this yarn, my friend Celeste invited me to join a Saturday once a month knitting group that she was in, which I got to go to a couple of times until COVID. But the first time I met with them, we went on a field trip. And we went to a town it's a little college town about an hour south of the Twin Cities called Northfield. I took this with me and I found a yarn that is a lustrous blend of Masham wool, merino, and mohair. And it's in a nice kind of charcoaly gray. And I thought, well, I'll get a sweater's quantity of this yarn and I'll find some way to use this yarn as an intarsia cable in it. And I just hadn't come up with anything, and I've been wanting to use this. It bugs me that it's just sitting there. And so when I found this sweater, I thought, I could recreate the sweater, so I don't have to really design it. I just have to reverse engineer it, which I don't think will be that hard. And then I can use this yarn somehow. And so I think I'm going to take some photographs of this and then see if I can colorize it to see what it would look like if I did certain cables in certain places. Because I don't know I have got a few ideas. Like one idea is just to do one up the back, not up the center, but kind of off center a little bit. Maybe, and then maybe one up the opposite sleeve of that. And then on the front, maybe just pocket tops. Like that's one idea. So I was spending some time looking at the sweater today, and I was looking at the button bands. I thought, oh, that's interesting. On the surface, it kind of looks like Knit One Pro One ribbing, but I think it's actually a tuck stitch or brioche, which I thought, I haven't seen that. I don't know if any of you guys have seen that, using brioche for the button bands. So I'm not, a lot of people love brioche, and I'm not that enamored with it. I like the way it looks, but I'm not that enamored with the knitting of it. I find it a little tedious, but I think because I do like the way it looks on this sweater, I'd be willing to use it for that. So I might be swatching for that pretty soon. Once I get this neck back on, grafted onto that 1890s sweater, I'm sure I'll be working on it now and again, but it's going to be a slog to, from that point on, just do the sleeves. So I'm going to want something to entertain myself. So that, I think, will be entertaining for me. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.